We made
Appreciate your patience.
We made it. So
Good to see Brother Rabbi.
let me ask the first question to the two of you. In 2017, you put out a statement entitled Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression. Thousands of professors, students, and others added their names to the statement at your invitation. What concerns prompted the statement? Was there a particular event that triggered it? The statement now looks prophetic, which is unfortunate. How do you assess the situation for freedom of thought and speech in the academy and our broader society today? Professor George, I'll ask you to start us off.
Well, thank you, Dan. And let me say, and I know I speak for Cornel as well as myself, in saying how honored and delighted we are to be appearing under the auspices of the Freedom Center and the American Culture and Ideas Initiative. We congratulate you and thank you for all the work you're doing. The statement in 2017 reflects the basic values that Cornel and I share when it comes to the purpose, the mission of scholars and of scholarly institutions of education, and our commitment as Republican citizens of a Republican democracy. We believe that both truth-seeking, the fundamental mission of scholarship and of teaching and of universities, and the institutions of Republican democracy have conditions that have to be in place if we're to accomplish our mission, if we're to accomplish our goals. And those conditions include a certain sort of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of discussion, the freedom that makes it possible for us to pursue truth and to work together, communicating with each other, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, hashing things out, arguing things out in the domain of public policy as a self-governing people. That is a Republican democracy. Now, we're not arguing for these great civil liberties of thought and expression and discussion as abstract ideals. Both of us believe that they are founded on aspects of the well-being and flourishing of human beings in the communities that we create. They're rooted in our sense of the special dignity that human beings as rational creatures possess. As Christians, the two of us believe that that has something fundamentally to do with human beings being made in the very image and likeness of God, something Jews and Christians believe. But even for those who don't share that particular faith or any particular religious faith, we hope that as citizens of a Republican democracy and as students, those who are professors as professors, will agree that truth-seeking is critical and that truth-seeking can't proceed without the conditions of freedom being in place. So that was our plea to our fellow citizens. Let's carefully sustain the freedoms that are necessary for universities to fulfill their mission and for Republican democracy to flourish.
Dr. West.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say that I am blessed to be here and I appreciate your work, your music, Brother Daniel, down through the years, the 6 symphonies and others. I appreciate the introduction, beginning with music. It's always a blessing to be in conversation with my dear brother, Rabbi. Very much so. And I think that when we talk about that lift every voice, you know that that's the anthem of Black people. It's the anthem of a hated people. It's the anthem of a people who generate love warriors in the face of that hatred, generate freedom fighters in the face of terror, and generate wounded healers in the face of trauma. And so when we're talking about lifting every voice, you know, this is not just an academic or an abstract thing. It's an attempt to try to get at what Brother Rabbi and I are fundamentally committed to, which is truth seeking. No one of us possess the truth, but we pursue the truth. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And that's every voice. It could be indigenous peoples right here in Arizona. It could be Mexico. It could be white brothers and sisters in Appalachia. It could be Ethiopians, Guatemalans, women, gays, lesbians, whatever it is. It's every voice, every human being made in the image and likeness of God. And so what we were trying to say was, we acknowledge that we live in a moment of pervasive spiritual decay and moral decrepitude. So it's not just polarization, but it's gangsterization. It's demonization. It's losing sight of the humanity of others and not wanting to listen to others. You're playing Duke Ellington. See, he's cultivating the capacity to learn how to listen, to receive as well as give. When you Bach, counterpoint, Goldberg variations that we could have gone on and wrestled with, those 30 variations. The counterpoint, the back and forth, the antiphonal, the call and response. That's what we were after in this statement, really. And it's one that is very difficult because when we engage in the quest for truth, it means it comes in on us. You know, that truth is Janus face. It's not just pointed at others, it's pointed at us, our own fallings, our own blind spots, our own foibles. And so Brother Robbie and I, believe quite seriously that we want to speak truth to power. We want to speak truth to the relatively powerless. We want to unsettle others. We want ourselves to be unsettled. That's true for the institutional sites in which we find ourselves. We can say more about that. It's true for where Robbie comes from at Princeton, my own background at Harvard, Sacramento, Mr. and Mrs. Georges, Jims and Jules that they are, and Mr. and Mrs. West, and the Jews and Jims that they are. And I know your parents are Jews too, Brother Daniel. But we're here to talk about some serious issues about freedom, truth, and the ways in which we could try to keep alive the best of a democracy. That is in very, very deep trouble.
So Dan, that specific triggering event that was the occasion of the 2017 statement was the highly publicized incident at Middlebury College when Professor Allison Stanger, who's a very distinguished professor of international relations who teaches at Middlebury, who's on the progressive side of the political spectrum, attempted to engage in conversation as a guest of the college, Charles Murray, the famous social scientist, controversial social scientist of the American Enterprise Institute. And as you'll recall, the event was repeatedly disrupted and ended with an act of violence against Dr. Murray and Professor Stanger, in which a mob threw Professor Stanger to the ground, causing her to sustain a concussion, from which it took her 2 years actually to recover. So seeing that sort of violence on a university campus, where an attempt at a conversation between two people who sharply disagree was disrupted in that kind of way, especially violent way, caused us to think, somebody's got to say something. Somebody's got to not just denounce that violence and decry that violence, but talk about what's fundamentally the purpose of educational institutions, and to root the importance of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of discussion in the values of truth-seeking and democracy. So that was why we did it.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring that up to date, as it were. Just a few months ago, which is July of 2020, the two of you joined again in another statement, this time entitled Honesty and Courage. Two great virtues, I hope we could all agree upon. It began with the provocative statement that honesty and courage alone, I'm going to stress alone, can rescue our wounded, disunited country now. Now, why do you regard these particular virtues, and you say those alone, as so necessary at this moment? And how does one go about promoting those virtues? Professor George?
Let me let Professor West go first this time.
Okay, Professor West.
No, absolutely. No, the event that constituted the catalyst for that was when, in fact, Princeton University decided to do away with the Woodrow Wilson name that our dear brother Chris, who was the president, had declared that they were going to do away with the name. Now, I went to graduate school at Princeton. We sat down with the president back in 1975 and argued to do away with the name. And of course, we we were not successful. And then they had some students to take over the president's office. It was 2015, no, Brother Rabbi, I think, or something. But I know I ended up paying for their hotel rooms when they were threatened. But they also put forth their argument. And so though I agree with taking the name off of this school, the integrity of the process was something I was concerned about, because what happened was it was a pontification from above with no serious conversation, dialogue, deliberation of faculty, of students, of a community. And when you have that kind of imperial administration, it's like an imperial president or imperial elite that's not accountable, then the process itself lacks a kind of deliberative democratic integrity. And so I told Rabbi, I said, this is another way in which people feel as if they can do things without accountability. And because the spiritual decay of our empire is shot through with cultures of impunity, people think they can just say and do anything and get away with it, even when I agree with the result, even when I agree with the end of the aim. If the process itself doesn't have a democratic and deliberative integrity to it, then we had to call it into question. So that's why honesty, that's why courage. And we were really defending the virtues as a whole, though, Brother Daniel. I mean, it was kind of a journalistic appropriation of just highlighting those two. We were defending the virtues as a whole: integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, faith, courage, love, compassion, sensitivity, and so forth. So that's what we were defending in that way. But go right ahead, Brother Rabbi.
Okay, so you're raising those two. Professor George.
Yes. We have a deep concern about the situation, especially in intellectual life today, in the academy, but really in the broader intellectual culture. So much of what people say seems to be focused on gaining followers, gaining likes, avoiding being canceled, avoiding being criticized, winning friends, winning the approval of one's ideological tribe. And to do that, people very often will say things they don't really believe, or say things in ways that are deeply problematic, but are meant to pander to a certain sort of audience. We've, across the country, not just in the intellectual culture, but more broadly, we see people putting themselves in silos. On one side, there are people listening to Fox News and reading the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and National Review magazine and being reinforced in all their conservative beliefs. On the other side, people watching MSNBC or CNN, reading The Nation, reading the New York Times editorial page, and being reinforced in their progressive beliefs, and not actually honestly seeking the truth, and not having the courage, because Cornel and I think it takes a lot of courage to be a genuine truth seeker. You have to fight to muster the courage to do that. I mean, I certainly find myself struggling to do that, because we human beings, we crave approval. We crave approval of people generally, and we crave the approval of people in our tribe or camp or ideological school of thought. It takes courage to stand up to oneself when it comes to that. Self-mastery, I guess all the great teachers of humanity, whether we're talking about the prophets of Israel, whether we're talking about Jesus, whether we're talking about the Buddha, whether we're talking about Confucius, all the great prophets of humanity, the great teachers of humanity, have noted that the biggest challenge we have in a human life is to be masters of ourselves. It's self-mastery, being able to say what we mean what we say, have integrity, as Cornel said, not be pushed around by passions, including the passion for the approval of others. So just at this moment, with so much virtue signaling and posturing and demagoguery and manipulation, really across the ideological spectrum, and so much people reinforcing themselves in their beliefs by what they listen to and what they read, we just felt it was time to make a plea for honesty and courage in particular. Now, as Cornel rightly points out, and again, as all the great teachers of humanity have pointed out, the virtues all come as a package. There's a kind of unity of the virtues that is important. When we put the emphasis on honesty and courage, That's not meant in any way to belittle the need for love and humility and compassion and all of the other virtues. It's just that this particular moment, what we're witnessing, causes us to think that what we need to revive most of all are honesty and courage.
Let me ask a question as a follow-up to something that Cornel said. It was the question about who should decide about what something should in fact be called. And Cornel, it brings to mind, at least to me, the question of, is there any place in any institutions of society where hierarchies are in fact a good thing? For example, I think George Will in his book on the conservative sensibility suggests, look, universities should be hierarchical. Students go there to, in fact, to study with faculty who have studied and trained and know things, and they want to learn those things from them. I would assume that Tampa Bay is very happy that in their hierarchy, they had Tom Brady as their quarterback, right? Somebody who can really throw a football better than just about anybody else. That's a certain kind of hierarchy that we admire in sports to see the best that can be produced. Am I wrong in suggesting that there are certain places in society, and that maybe the university is one of them, that at least in some aspects should be hierarchical? So Cornel, maybe you want to go first, and then Rabbi. I'd be curious about your opinions on that, and particularly in the university, since that's where we function.
Well, I think I begin with the notion, though, brother, that to wrestle with what it means to be human is to aspire to certain forms of excellence, what the Greeks call arete. There's spiritual excellence, there's moral excellence, there's artistic excellence, there's political excellence, there's social excellence. And the question becomes, how do we wrestle with the definitions of what those excellences are? And there'll always be disagreements. There'll always be diversity, heterogeneity, variety of wrestling, but at least we know we're talking about excellence. I'm glad that Stephen Sondheim went to study with Milton Babbitt at Princeton. He learned something. And he went on to give us all these great gifts, right? I'm glad that Beiderbecke sat at the feet of Louis Armstrong when he went from Iowa to Chicago. He learned something from towering figures, and they ended up learning from each other, right? That Mary Lou Williams, when she sat down and played that piano, she was teaching something to a Jerry Allen. And they went on to become great artists of excellence within their respective genres and so forth. So all we're doing is just telling folk, these are the ways in which to be human is to undergo forms of education, cultivation, and maturation in light of what is excellent. So that there's always going to be a hierarchy. The problem becomes when hierarchy itself, based on power, based on structures of domination, want no accountability, no answerability, and don't want to take responsibility, or want to stop conversation, or want to shut down communication. And as Brother Rabbi says, it cuts across the board. It cuts across the board. I mean, I was glad to receive a lot of letters from my progressive brothers and sisters saying, Brother West, I'm telling you, we're not sure you should go to the Freedom Center. By being there, you're going to legitimate their platform. They tied the right-wing money and the money coming out of the state legislature. Why would you even be part of that conversation? I tell them, I appreciate their attempt to keep me accountable. Now I've got a counter argument. I believe we lift every voice. I believe we go in every context and engage in truth seeking. I want to speak the truth about University of Arizona, myself, Rabbi, the center, this ties the money. Let's open it up. Let's have a robust conversation across the board. But in doing that, we're recognizing we're after something bigger than us. Because you see, the excellences that I'm talking about, and this is where Rabbi and I are very similar, because we tied to the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. You see, the great excellences will be found in your service to those who are most vulnerable, who are most weak, the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, that hesed that sits at the center of the genius of Hebrew scripture. To do justly, walk humbly with their God. So that sense of using the gifts of excellences in order to empower and enable, that is, for me, what is very important in terms of the lifting of every voice. I know I'm going on too long, but Brother Rabbi.
No. I really just...
If you'll comment then on that question of excellence. Well, what Cornel brings in also, okay, we're to help the poor, the widow. Yes, I get that from my Hebrew scriptures. Is that the fundamental task of the university? Or are different institutions involved in different aspects of excellence? And is it incumbent upon us perhaps to separate, at least in some sense, those institutions and their goals that they have?
Well, there are several questions there, Dan, and I think we need to sort through them. First, I want to say amen and hallelujah to what Cornel just said. The pursuit of excellence is never out of season. It's always in place everywhere. Now, that includes excellence in respect of issues such as justice and charity, goodwill, compassion. It's not just being a great quarterback or being a wonderful chess player or being a great scholar, although those are also excellences. Now, do different institutions have different missions? Absolutely. The mission of the university, the fundamental defining mission of the university is truth-seeking. That's what scholarship needs to be aimed at. That's the telos, if we can use that Greek term, the goal, the aim, the purpose, the justifying aim of universities. That's why in our teaching, we need to be teaching and not indoctrinating. Indoctrinating is the enemy of truth-seeking. Indoctrination is the very antithesis of education. And if we're going to have real education and not indoctrination, yes, you need a hierarchical relationship of teacher and student. That's certainly true. And yet, the goal needs to be turning the student into a truth seeker, a learner, someone who understands and is able to think for himself or herself. If as a teacher, I take my goal to be telling my students what to think or inducing them to think in the way that I think about this or that particular issue or about life generally, then I'm a teacher in name only. A real teacher is not someone who tries to tell students what to think or make them think or induce them to think in the way that he thinks. A real teacher is a person who teaches and encourages and empowers his students to think deeply, to think critically, and to think for themselves. A real teacher doesn't have disciples. A real teacher has empowered students to think for themselves and be independent thinkers. A real teacher will very often create his own best critics. And if you look at the greatest of teachers, you will find that that's true. Can you think of a better critic of Plato than Aristotle? My own teachers generated some of their own best critics, and their teachers generated some of their own best critics. Now, when you talk about the issue of hierarchy, I think there's another concept that has to be introduced, and that is the concept of authority. All institutions that are large enough and complex enough to require anything more than a kind of New England town meeting to decide what to do will have some structure of authority. But as Cornel pointed out, the issue of how you establish who's in authority, the issue of what offices to create, who is to occupy those offices, for what terms, and how we are to have accountability for those who are occupying those offices. Those apparently merely or superficially merely procedural issues actually have substantive moral content. For example, in our system, we value democracy not simply as a way that we have that produces pretty good decisions on the whole and in the long run, but we value it for moral reasons as well. We value it because it honors the fundamental equality and dignity of all citizens, of all, indeed, of all members of the human family. I think whatever legitimate hierarchies we have in our institutions, and there are legitimate hierarchies, no question about that, they don't vitiate the most fundamental sense in which there is no hierarchy, the most fundamental sense in which there's equality. And that is the sense in which we are all equal in respect of our inherent dignity. We can note, and for very many purposes, there are good reasons to recognize and act on the differences between people. A great athlete like Michael Jordan or Tom Brady, a great physicist like Albert Einstein, a great singer like Mahalia Jackson, a great composer like Bach. We should recognize their greatness. We're not all equal when it comes to athletic talent or musical talent or intellectual talent. And yet, there's a sense more fundamental than any of that in which we're all equal. And we can test that with a simple thought experiment. I hope we would all say, I trust that we would all say, that however great we think Michael Jordan or Albert Einstein or any other great figure is, we would consider it unacceptable, scandalous to, say, kidnap and murder an innocent child, perhaps a cognitively disabled child, for the sake of harvesting vital organs to give a transplant to some great figure, some great physicist or great singer or great quarterback who needs a heart transplant. When we answer that question correctly and say that would be a scandalous thing, we would never tolerate that, what we are paying tribute to is that principle of the fundamental and inherent equality of human beings, equality and dignity.
Now, listen, each question I ask could provide a response of an hour or two. I'm well aware of that. And this is good stuff, but I'm just going to ask you guys to think about that, because boy, do I want to get to a bunch of stuff. Look,
you want us to be a little shorter in our answers.
Yeah, you know, it's like Miles saying to Keith Jarrett, enough already. Okay, now I'm back. Okay, you're both philosophers and you specialize in the analysis of issues of justice and other moral questions. And Rabbi, you just alluded to that. And you're both very publicly men of faith. That's something a little bit outside of our structure here, but I'm bringing it in anyway, because we as musicians and artists talk about transcendence. So we have to look at that word. You're men of faith who talk about the role of religion in our public life and in addressing issues of public concerns. And Rabbi, you just did that. So comment a little bit on the role that you think faith communities or other communities, right? Whether it's the Center for Philosophy of Freedom, which as I've seen more and more works as a community, right? How do these different ways of viewing yourselves? We're complex people. We have different ways of looking at the world within ourselves. How do you do this as men of faith and philosophers?
I think that most of the great, if not all of the great religious traditions, whatever forms it takes, tries to keep track of the ways in which greed corrupts, the way in which hatred corrupts, the way in which indifference to the vulnerable corrupts, the way in which callousness to other people's suffering corrupts. And when you get enough greed and enough indifference and enough callousness, then your institutions will lose their legitimacy. And when they lose their legitimacy, then it ends up toward, at least it moves toward a Hobbesian war of all against all. So you get this language in Clausewitz, the philosopher of war. You get this language in Foucault, of bringing militaristic metaphors into his understanding of relation to power and truth, because they all were living in moments in which their institutions were so driven by corruption, just like our own moment. And so the real challenge of those who have faith, and I think of the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who used to say, well, the aim is to try to get our souls out of the dark pit of greed and hatred and contempt so that we can generate enough context in which we can have communication mediated with some respect. And that's the public stuff of a democracy. You can't have a democracy without vital public life. You can't have public life unless you have trust. You can't have trust unless you have context where people are willing to spend time with one another, even as they deeply disagree. They can still revel in each other's humanity. And that's what being, so Brother Rabbi and I, we've been at this for 15 years now, right? Because we have a good time. We love each other. We wrestle with each other. We show each other right and wrong. We know that there's life and death issues. So that in that regard, you know, we know that we can learn, and we have deep commonality in terms of commitment to rights and liberties. And Brother Rabbi hears about a Mark Lamont Hill, who's been critical of Israeli policies. He's got deep disagreements with Brother Mark. But when Mark gets efforts to push him out, call in question his tenure, Brother Rabbi's the first one there because he defends civil liberties, even of those he disagrees with. Mm-hmm. There's a constancy, there's a consistency, and I've tried to do the same thing my own way. So this issue of faith, you know, it's just a matter of how do you view the world through moral and spiritual lens in which you keep track of the humanity of everybody, no matter whether you agree or disagree, and then see whether we can create some public spaces to keep a fragile democratic project alive, given the decay in the empire in which we find ourselves.
Rabbi?
Just a few months ago, Dan, as you and Brother Cornel know, and I'm sure many of the participants in the call know, we lost one of the great religious leaders of our time, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He happened to be a very dear friend of mine, but he was a great teacher of humanity. I keep coming back to that concept of a teacher of humanity. Brother Cornel is one, by the way. But that's what Rabbi Sachs was. Of course, he's a great leader of the Jewish community, but he was really a teacher of all of us. And just before his death, he was only 72 years old, he published what turned out to be his last book, which was entitled Morality, simply Morality, with the subtitle, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. Now, Rabbi Sachs taught, as any good rabbi would, that fundamental dignity exists in us as individual persons. That's why we must never yield to the utilitarian temptation to treat people as means to larger ends. We should never sign up for the idea that you have to break eggs to make an omelet, and some people have to be sacrificed for the sake of the greater good or a larger good. We believe in the dignity of the individual. And I know at the Freedom Center, that's something that you place a lot of emphasis on. And Rabbi Sachs would be right there with you saying amen. But at the same time, and in no way incompatibly with that, Rabbi Sachs noticed that we had become radically individualistic as a society. All the focus now seems to be on me, myself, and I, my interests, my desires, my goals, my getting ahead, my being somebody important, my being wealthier, my having greater social standing, my having prestige. And Rabbi Sachs says we've gone too far. We've lost the concept of the common good, not in some utilitarian sense that would justify sacrificing the dignity of the individual to a larger collective goal, the way Mao Zedong would or Stalin would, but in a much more profound sense, a sense in which we would recover our own communion with other people, first of all, in the intimate relationship of the family, and then the small communities to which we belong, sometimes communities of religious faith, or even neighborhoods, various kinds of non-governmental associations, but also including our being citizens of a particular nation, a particular place with a certain allegiance, a certain patriotic spirit, but also, and even beyond that, understanding our relationship with our fellow human beings, of whom we are all ultimately brothers and sisters under the fatherhood of God. And I think Rabbi Sachs really hit the nail on the head here. We've gone too far in the direction of radical libertarianism. And without falling into the opposite evil of collectivism, we need to restore the understanding of the common good. And to do that, we have to see that we are persons in communion with other people. Other people are not just means to our ends. We have a relationship with them of solidarity, such that our interests are intertwined with their interests in a deep and personal way. And so we need to be willing to pay a price, to sacrifice for other people, not just the members of our own family, but even more broadly. Human beings at their best respect individual rights and liberties, but they also understand themselves as members of communities. Communities that it makes sense to belong to, not simply because we need the help of other people to achieve our individualistic ends, but communities it makes sense to belong to because belonging to them is inherently fulfilling of us. We have to understand that being a member of a community, with all the rights and obligations that attach to that, is a way of our achieving the fulfillment that is available to us as human beings, as persons who naturally long for communion with other people.
If I might just follow up with that quickly before we go to another question, since it's President's Day, and that's what Tocqueville discovered about Americans. One of the things that he remarked upon is, wherever you turn, Americans are making some other kind of community, some other formation, whether it's insurance societies, whether it's libraries, whether it's square dancing societies, doesn't make any difference. We are a people that form those communities. That seems to be under threat right now, but let's hope that we can revivify those, just as you both have said. So as you know,
can I just say a quick word about that, Dan, and I'd love to have Cornel comment on this as well. What Tocqueville is talking about there, and what you're talking about, are sometimes called the institutions of civil society.
Yeah.
When people ask me, what kind of conservative are you? Because now there are all sorts of different flavors of conservative. Of course, there are nationalist conservatives and populist conservatives and libertarian conservatives and this conservative and that conservative. There's probably something similar on the progressive side. But when I'm asked that question, the answer is fundamentally, I'm a civil society conservative. I want to revitalize, renew, re-empower the institutions of civil society, which I think do the best job when they're healthy, play the primary role when it comes to health, education, and welfare, and to passing on to each new generation the values and the virtues that are necessary for human beings to lead successful lives as upright people and be good citizens. Now, Tocqueville didn't invent it. He's a great theorist and commentator on civil society, but he wasn't even the first to notice the importance of the institutions of civil society. Cornel, who is a terrific scholar of Burke, among other things, will recognize Burke's concept, which I'm about to mention, of what we call civil society functioning as the little platoons that do so much of the heavy lifting when it comes to turning us human beings into civilized people who can be kind to each other, who can be generous, who can be truthful, who can be non-manipulative, who can sacrifice for the sake of other people. It's those little platoons that need to be restored to their proper place and need to flourish.
Okay, Cornel.
I think this is very important in terms of the point I was making about the crisis of legitimacy. I mean, one of the reasons why de Tocqueville and his friend Beaumont, who came here to study prisons, wrote such a powerful text is he was a true seeker. And in being a true seeker, he realized that even those civic institutions that he saw on the vanilla side of the country, it was on somebody else's land. That last chapter, that long chapter in volume 1 on indigenous peoples, there was slavery in place. There was patriarchal institutions in place, so that there were costs even given these democratic breakthroughs that had to do with a rich civic life that Brother Rabbi is talking about. And so this is what Niebuhr meant when he said democracy is a proximate solution to insoluble problems. You continually have to respond to new forms of domination, new kinds of dogma, new forms of death, and that's what it is to be human as well. But he knew it was a dynamic process. And when you have a crisis of legitimacy that we have right now, and the virtues drop out, and the inability to relate as human beings drop out, then you're on the way to tyranny. Then you're on the way to fascism. then you're on your way to Hobbes' war of all against all, Leviathan. And that's, I think, in part what we're wrestling with today. And one of the reasons why what Brother Rabbi and I have discovered over the years as we travel in Black communities, brown communities, upper class, middle class, working class, across the board, is that we can see just how overwhelmed people are, morally, spiritually, economically, and the communities that we talk about, if they don't have food, if they don't have shelter, if they don't have health care, they don't have quality education, if they don't have quality relations, then it's going to be very difficult to sustain the democratic project. I mean, Sheldon Wolden's probably written the greatest book ever put pen to paper on de Tocqueville, the radical Democrat, who was a colleague of Brother Robbie and my thesis advisor and so forth, radical Democrat. It's a great book on de Tocqueville and what happens when you lose sight of both his insights as well as how we can understand our present the way he understood his present. Because he was always acknowledging the new kinds of breakthroughs that had to take place. And he was an aristocrat. He was no Democrat, small d, but he was searching for truth. And he was opening up new ways in which we see the world. And we've yet in some ways come to terms with it.
So in regards to that, of new ways of seeing the world, you guys both know that I'm a composer as well as working in academia. Do you have any thoughts on the situation in the arts today and how the arts can play a constructive role in the project of cultural renewal, which the two of you are champions? What does that mean for artists? What is
well, Brother Robbie's quite an artist too. He doesn't play the banjo for nothing. I tell you that. He plays a serious banjo and sings. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, what Cornel's referring to there, of course, is I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. And of course, Dan, where I come from, when we think of classical music, we think of bluegrass. That's Appalachian classical music. And I grew up playing the banjo, playing bluegrass banjo. I was a disciple, as all bluegrass banjo players are, of the great Earl Scruggs, who was from the mountains of North Carolina. I love that kind of music. It was the soundtrack of my life growing up, and I continue to play it. Now, of course, we've seen that music take off in such wonderful directions because of influences that are coming in from other traditions, from what you regard as classical music, for example. You see that in the banjo work of the German bluegrass banjo player Jens Kruger, bringing in all sorts of modes or genres of classical music, Bach, for example. You see it in the jazz-inflected music of Bela Fleck, the great contemporary banjo player, Bela Fleck. At the same time, the great banjo players in my tradition always recognize and remember where their roots are. When Bela Fleck came to Princeton to give us a concert at McCarter Theater with his wife, who's also a great banjo player herself, at one point he simply said to the audience, as he was giving us a bit of patter between the songs, he simply said, "I am a disciple of Earl Scruggs." Now, Bela Fleck can play things beyond anything Earl Scruggs would even attempt if Scruggs were still alive today. And yet what Fleck was saying is, my music to have integrity has to be faithful to those roots. It doesn't mean I can never deviate. It doesn't mean I can't bring in jazz or the African traditions. Fleck is now famous for bringing in African music. He's bringing in elements of Indian music. You see the influence, for example, of the great sitarist Ravi Shankar in Bela Fleck's music. But still, there's that integrity that is based on recognizing and honoring the roots. He never allows himself to forget, in a certain sense, musically now, where he came from.
Got it. Cornel.
Yeah, I would argue that artists are the vanguard of the species, that they represent the best of who we are as human beings because they acknowledge that they're willing to take a risk in the name of vision, courage, experimentation, exploration, willing to empty themselves, willing to donate themselves in light of earlier artists who have emptied themselves. And in emptying themselves, they get us unsettled and unnerved. So that when you see Rembrandt, you see kenosis on the canvas. It's all there. Beethoven, kenosis in sound, it's all there. Gerd, Toni Morrison, Aretha Franklin, they are learning how to heighten their vulnerability through creativity to give to us alternatives to a reality. They authorize alternative realities and all of the possibilities that are lingering therein. And that's the only way that the species is able to stay alive. I mean, when Oscar Wilde argued that Jesus was the greatest of artists in jail when he wrote that, what did he mean? He meant that, in fact, like Shelley, he legislates a different world. The Hebrew prophets, they legislate a different world. When Esther stands before the powers that be, she sees a different world. So does Amos. So does Martin King. So does Dorothy Day. They see a different world. And how do you connect with that world? Well, the artists often are the unacknowledged legislators, as Shelley says, the hierophants of unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the future cast on the present that allow us to spill over and remain vital and vibrant members of a species and pass it on to the next generation. So the artists, I think, in all of their freedom, we're not talking about one kind of art, we're not talking about a school of art, but most importantly, they exemplify our sense of what it is to be free, loving, embracing in their own particular ways. Now you can have artists who are fascists. Ezra Pound, fascist. Ezra Pound's poetry, fascinating. He's got something going on other than just fascism, because he can't control that creativity that connects to the Shakespeares and others who unsettle any fascist regime. That's the crucial role of the artist. And I think musicians even become in some ways more special, but I'll leave that to Brother Daniel. The work that Brother Rabbi worked at.
So
I think
Cornel, you brought up a good.
I think it'd be a mistake to suppose, as some people suggest sometimes, that to be an artist or to be a great artist is to be transgressive. Now, it's true that some artists and some great artists are transgressive, but artists represent the spectrum in the same way that philosophers represent the spectrum. There are great ideas that are conservative. There are great ideas that are radical. There are great ideas that are transgressive. There are great ideas that don't fit into any of those categories. And just as those ideas are expressed by philosophers in a certain idiom, they are expressed by artists. Some artists can reinforce through their art, whether it's literature, whether it's painting, whether it's music, whether it's poetry, can express the profound goodness of some things that do exist. Others can express, or sometimes even the same artist in another work can express the defectiveness, the need for reform, even radical reform of what exists, the need for a certain sort of order that perhaps has been dominant for decades or even centuries to be overturned. So there's a spectrum here, ideologically, philosophically, politically, in the same way there is in other disciplines such as philosophy.
But Brother Robert, you would agree, you take somebody like Hayek, he's hanging out at LSE, he's there with mainly leftists. When he writes the road to serfdom, he is transgressive. He's going against the consensus of what is in place. And he says, you all have blind spots precisely because you have a consensus in the name of a conservatism, which is to say in the name of a deep fear of the concentration of power in the public sphere of the state, the collectivism that can lead toward authoritarianism. I will be transgressive. And then here comes the left and say, well, Hayek, there's more than one road to serfdom. More than one road to serfdom. You got concentration of power in the private sector. You got a concentration of power with just men or just white folk or just so-and-so. We've got to have some ways in which we decentralize and have mechanisms of accountability. So transgression is really a context-dependent notion. You see what I mean?
Well, I would agree with that, but I think that just as philosophers sometimes need to be engaged in projects of conservation, and other times need to be engaged in projects of reform. The same is true for
Mhm.
artists. And it can be even in the life of the same artist, that some of what he does,
Right.
what he does at one time is a project of conservation, and at other times, a project of reform. I don't want to put the artist in a box any more than I want to put the philosopher.
Right. No, it's true.
You know,
But it's
certainly,
like Mendelssohn's recuperation of Bach. That was a
yeah,
restoration project in the early part of the 19th century, right?
that's a restoration
Why?
project.
But part of it was he was making available an artist that would unleash unprecedented possibilities for folk who didn't even understand who Bach was.
Exactly right.
So the restoration goes hand in hand with the transgression is not my word. I would say
Well, what about renewal?
experimentation. That's my word, you see. Experimentation. Because when you experiment, the past and present are always already involved in interplay in order to authorize a better future. You see?
I'll give you a word. Let me give you an alternative to that.
Okay, all right.
How about the word prophetic, prophecy?
Ooh, now you're going biblical on me. Oh, that's my weak spot. That's my weak spot, brother. You know that.
Not just biblical, although certainly biblical. I mean, there are biblical prophets, but there are other prophets as well.
Absolutely.
And
secular prophets.
Is a project of renewal. What's a prophet? Why can the prophet see the future? Prophet's not a guy who predicts the future. He's not a fortune teller. The prophet can see the future and what's going to happen, or what will happen if we don't change our ways, because he understands the past, and he understands the value of the principles that we should be clinging to. And he knows that when we abandon those principles, we're going to set ourselves on a path to catastrophe. That's what the prophet does. So it's a kind of project of renewal. And when I think of Mendelssohn and the recovery of Bach, I really see it in terms of renewal. In that sense, it's sort of quasi-prophetic. So rather than experimentation, yeah, okay.
I'd agree. I mean, the three pillars that the great Heschel talks about: remembrance, reverence, and resilience and resistance.
Yes, that's right.
All three simultaneously.
If you're going to bring up Heschel, Cornel, then we can bring up another famous rabbi who viewed life as going across that great bridge over the canyon. And in fact, artists are always going over that bridge and pulling something back to humanity to teach something that's new. The best artists are doing that. They're trying to find that new view, that new connection, that new synapse that teaches us something that we haven't known before. Now, gentlemen, I want you to know we've retained almost our entire audience. There's only a few slackers who've left us, only 100 or so. So I'm going to suggest that we go to some questions now for about another 10, 15 minutes. And if people are going to stay on, more the merrier.
Absolutely. We go with the spirit. We go with the spirit.
Here you go. Here you go. The set's not over. You have not commented, either of you, on the environment where we are now, where facts don't matter, and or where everyone is entitled to their own facts, to turn Moynihan's premise on its head. We're also in an environment, I'll add to that, of disinformation and or big tech that makes it difficult now to figure out what in fact is real or isn't real. We don't know how we're being manipulated, as it were. Can you talk a little bit about where we are in regards to that? This is a new age, a new time. The communities that we spoke of earlier, our family, maybe even family before sitting in front of the TV and having a TV dinner, but actually communicating. Or spiritual communities, right? Where we actually engage with each other. Artistic communities where, God willing, we'll get back in the concert hall and be together witnessing something. And I use that word for both of you men of faith, witnessing something. That's what the performer is doing with us, right? I recognize that as a Jew. So where are we in regards to that question? That was a little bit diffuse. I apologize.
Oh, it's a good question. Yeah, Brother Rabbi, you want to jump in first?
Sure, Cornel, I'll go first. This takes me back to the point I made earlier about the problem of us putting ourselves in silos these days, and everybody reinforced in what they already think. And even when it comes to questions of fact, we rely on news outlets or websites or commentaries that will shape the facts or shade the facts in a way that fits in with our ideology. That's not a good thing. I think all of us need to cultivate diverse sources of information and analysis. I'll give you a good place to start. If you're a conservative, okay, if you're a conservative, I'm a conservative. If you're one of my fellow conservatives, and you're only listening to Fox News or watching Fox News, and listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio, and reading the Wall Street Journal editorial page, you need to broaden your sources of information there. I'll ask you, I mean, if you're a conservative and you haven't read Cornel West's classic book, Race Matters, well, you're not in a position really to discuss some of the most important issues that we're wrestling with today. Those issues of race. If you're only reading people on the conservative side, now I do want you to read people on the conservative side. I want you to read Thomas Sowell. I benefited enormously from reading Thomas Sowell. And Shelby Steele, I benefited enormously from reading Shelby Steele, but I've also benefited enormously from reading Cornel West. Now, if you're on the progressive side, you've read Cornel West, you've read Race Matters, you've read Democracy Matters. Have you read Thomas Sowell? Have you read Shelby Steele? Have you read Mary Ann Glennon? Have you read Leon Cass? Have you read Yuval Levin? All of us need to familiarize ourselves not only with the best thinkers and writers on our side of the ideological divide, but with the best thinkers and writers who will challenge us, who will, as Cornel said, unsettle us, who will question what we take to be dogmas or orthodoxies. And again, this applies across the spectrum. I'll bet most conservatives have not read and probably couldn't name the best writers on the left. And I know from my experience being in a university where most people are on the left, that an awful lot of people haven't read, and some couldn't even name the best writers on the conservative side of the spectrum. That's an unsatisfactory situation. So let's broaden our sources of information and analysis. And even at the personal level, if you're a progressive and you're spending all your time around your fellow progressives, they're just reinforcing what you already think. You're not going to get anywhere that way. Cultivate some friends on the conservative side. Believe it or not, they're really smart, well-intentioned, well-meaning, good-spirited, good-hearted conservatives who are willing to talk to you. Same for you conservatives. You know, if you're spending all your time being reinforced in your friendships and relationships with your fellow conservatives, get out and meet somebody. Cultivate some friends who are on the progressive side, who are thoughtful and want to have a conversation and want to discuss things and are not only smart, but also good-hearted and good-spirited. They are out there, but you need to do some reaching out. The key thing is to get out of these darn silos. These silos are ruining us.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that we human beings, we have always had problems with illusion, appearance, access to facts and truth from the very beginning of the human experiment. And what I mean by that is that how do you cultivate courage and fortitude to really want to see clearly, even when it's painful, even when it's critical of you, to feel deeply and to act courageously, even when you have to take a major risk, you see. So that what has happened now is just on a mass scale. But I mean, Plato begins the Western philosophical tradition with what? A distinction between reality and appearance. They're in the cave. They're seeing things that don't really exist. They're after something that's beyond the shadows in the cave. And we can go all the way up to Descartes. You can go to Pirandello's plays. It's all illusion. It's all projection. It's posing. It's posturing. Just like our society of spectacle today. Everybody's got their image and their brand. And they're rich, how smart they are and how much money they got. That's nothing but just, in the end, a kind of illusion when it comes to the deep quest for truth that Brother Rabbi and I are talking about. So every generation, every civilization, Africa, Europe, Asia, indigenous peoples, Latin America, you've always had folk who want to just manipulate and dominate and connect mendacity to criminality, tell the lies in order to hide the crimes. That's a human thing all the way down. I don't care what color you are. I don't care what gender. I don't care what nation. That's a human thing. So then the question becomes, how do you cultivate enough people to say, you know what, we see things, so that in Hebrew scripture, we see the stranger. We see the humanity of the stranger. Jesus sees the Samaritan. He's supposed to be demonized. She's supposed to be trashed. No, I see Mary Magdalene. She might be the only one at the tomb. Ooh, so much for the disciples and their courage, right? Muhammad, I'm going to have these Jews and these Muslims in Medina live together. I see something that other folk don't see. Broadening, that's what education is about. Shattering the parochialism, shattering the narrowness, but we all know it's an endless process. But in the end, it's about acting courageously. And see, that's a whole different issue in terms of how you actually muster courage and fortitude to cut against the grain and be willing to bear cost. And that's where, students come in. We want our students to be able to see, feel, act, but do it not self-righteously, but to do it self-critically, because they can always learn and we can learn from them.
Courageously and honesty. Rabbi, Cornel, I think that was a wonderful summation of your position, by the way. So I'm going to suggest that we start to summarize, because it took us back to honor and courage, which was one of the first articles. So Rabbi, if you can provide a little summarization as well. And Cornel, if I didn't give you enough time to summarize, be my guest, my friend. Come on.
My brother, you've been kind to me. You've been kind to me. I appreciate it.
But Rabbi, go ahead.
Absolutely.
Well, Cornel mentioned students, and Dan, you and Cornel and I have all devoted our lives to the education of young men and women. It's what we do. If we didn't think it was valuable and important, we'd be doing something where we could make more money. Now, what are the problems we're facing today with our young people? Well, there's some crises. One of them, of course, manifests itself in a tendency toward ideology and intellectual intolerance. This manifests itself in the cancel culture, in the attempts to shut down free speech, to reject the very idea of being challenged, to consider any challenge to be a personal attack or a personal assault. And that's a serious problem. Cornel and I have done our best to push back against it. It's there. But I don't think it's the biggest problem, as big as it is. The bigger problem, and again, you find it across the spectrum, whether young people are on the right or on the left, wherever their politics is, it's a problem of values. Somehow our young people are getting the message, and parents and coaches and teachers and pastors, please listen to this. Somehow our young people are getting the message that what is really important in life is achievement, wealth, status, prestige, influence, celebrity, getting ahead. Now, of course, they're told, you need to do it honestly, you need to have integrity, but those values are being presented to our young people, or in any event, our young people are somehow adopting those values as if they were what was fundamental and important. And nothing could be further from the truth. Now, those things aren't bad in themselves, wealth and influence and power and celebrity. They can be used for good things, but they're not what ultimately matters. What ultimately matters are things like family, faith, friendship, honor, integrity, compassion. Those are what's fundamental and not derivative. And yet, why aren't our children getting the message? They are prioritizing what David Brooks calls the resume values or the CV values over what he calls the tombstone values. And we need to get the focus on what we want on our tombstone, what we want to be remembered for. Do we want to be remembered because we were an important celebrity, or because we had a lot of money, or because we had a lot of influence? Probably not. What we want to be remembered for is that we were honorable people, that we were devoted to our families, that we were good and true and loyal friends, that we had integrity. So we adults and we teachers and pastors and parents and coaches need to be about the business of not only preaching sound values to our young men and women, but modeling them and exemplifying them. Because even if you're a classroom teacher, your students learn more from what you do than from what you say. We need to teach by Precept to be sure, but even more importantly, by example.
Cool. Gentlemen, so Cornel, I hope that the fears of your friends suggested to you were assuaged, because I can only tell you I've enjoyed this discussion immensely. So I thank both you and Robert George for being with us. I think everybody who participated found it engrossing. And let me tell you, I don't say that about every lecturer. I don't say that about every piece of music I hear. I just want you to know. I just want you to know. So this was absolutely wonderful. I thank you. I thank all of our participants who joined us for this event. As a little present, there will be a 5-minute postlude of a piece called Reflections, which is my take on the rag idiom, which Scott Joplin gave to the world in the same way that Bach gave the fugue to the world. It lasts a little under 5 minutes. If you want to stay on and listen, you're welcome to do so, maybe to help you contemplate where we've been for the last hour and a half.
Is this piece of music by you, Brother Daniel?
It is by me.
Oh, we should say that, indeed.
I'm sorry. It is, in fact,
we're looking at the composer himself.
That's it. Beautiful. Remember, all music that you hear was originally written by somebody who actually lived.
That's right. That's right.
Something we forget. Somebody who had all of the same problems we did, the same joys and the same sorrows. So here's Ragflections coming up. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Brother Dan.
My pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.
And we have to unfortunately apologize for the lack of technical accessibility for that piece. I very much apologize. So Dan, we can't do that. I apologize.
Okay, apparently we're out of time and we're having a technical problem like at the start. Welcome to the new technological age. But guess what? It's on a new CD, folks. So go find the CD. It's called I You'll love it. You'll love it. See you, everybody.
Yeah, Dan.
Couldn't resist.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
You know, Scott Joplin was a great master.
Oh, tremendous.
That genre was fantastic.
Tremendous.
I play a little of that style on the guitar. Of course, it's not a style that we usually associate with the guitar. We associate with the piano. But I love the music. Maple Leaf Rag. The Entertainer, of course, became so famous because of the movie.
Sure.
Wonderful. And that was brother Marvin. What was his name? Hamlish.
Is that right? Did he do it? Yeah.
You might also want to listen to a piece called Tremonisha. It was his opera.
Oh yeah, I saw that on Broadway. I saw that on Broadway. Many decades ago.
That's right. Dr. Schuler brought it back. A guy who.
That's exactly right.
So all sorts of good stuff, gentlemen. This is lovely what you do. Just so you know.
Well, thank you, Dan.
I'm sure you've had people tell you that before, like everybody over the last 15 years, but this was just a great pleasure to hear you guys talk.
Thank you.
Well, you did a marvelous job, but you know, you were like Duke Ellington, just orchestrating and conducting. We just going with the flow. We just moving with the flow. But
Cornel, I'm sure that you do this very well without a conductor, but I would like to think as a conductor that, yeah, it can be useful now and then. Okay.
You know, Dan, I happened onto something today. I sometimes fish around at lunchtime on YouTube for things to watch and listen to. And I just happened on to a video performance. I don't know what the date was, of the wonderful old hymn, Just As I Am, which was always used by Billy Graham. Cornel, do you remember this? It was used by Billy Graham.
Just as I am. La, 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 la. Yeah, it's a beautiful song. Beautiful song.
I happened onto the version by Mahalia Jackson. I'm telling you, if you haven't, go to YouTube and type in Mahalia Jackson, Just As I Am. It is the most magnificent rendition of that song you've ever. And I've heard a lot.
I gotta check that out tonight. Check that out.
Pure simplicity. No choir behind or anything like that. Man,
yeah.
And it's such a hymn.
So listen, you're cruising the internet. How do you guys keep up with all the stuff that you should be taking part in. I mean, Cornel, just so you know, Robbie turned me on to the fact that you were on a show with Bill Buckley. Now, I've seen a bunch of Bill Buckley stuff, but I haven't seen you on. But okay, that's another hour that I really investigate, right? Unless you tell me I shouldn't have.
Dan, I would recommend many shows before you get to that. I tell you that.
Dan, you have to share with Cornel. You have to reveal my secret. You have to tell Cornel what I told you. I found so remarkable about that video.
Oh, Cornel. So Robbie let it out of the bag. What he said was that back then, way back then, he said you had short hair and you were the most stylish guy around.
I did it with one handsome devil.
One handsome devil.
Okay. We do still have the panelists, attendees with us, by the way, just so you know.
We still have the panelists with us.
Oh, no, that's cool. That's cool. Tell them we just having a debrief, and that's how we debrief. That's how we roll.
This is the guys and gals going outside after playing and just trying to cool down.
That's exactly right. I'm sorry we don't have any cognac. You know, we share some cognac for those who'd be open to it. That's what we usually do. I have a little cognac, Brother Rabbi have a little wine.
Yeah.
He's Catholic and I'm Baptist, so I'm a little bit freer. You know, I'm a little bit freer when it comes to
that. I got you. I got you.
Oh, indeed. But no, it was wonderful to have the people who were kind enough to take this time out, though. You know, that was it's a lovely thing, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting some. Robert, you might want to put up on the chat that the music cannot be played. Some people are sending notes saying, "Where's the music? Where's the music?"
And this is Brother James right here, though, right?
Okay, so let me put it out there, gentlemen. I should say this, you know, this is fun. So if you ever want to broaden it, I mean, you should have 3, you should have 2. I mean, both of you deal with the Trinity. I mean, this concept, I don't know how you came up with it. You should have had Brother Jonathan Sachs on. You know, he's much more famous than I.
Cornel, did we ever do a program with Rabbi Sachs? I'm trying to remember. I don't think we did. Did we together?
We were with him at Princeton when he came to give a presentation, but you were in dialogue with him. I was in the audience.
Oh, you were in the audience, yeah.
I was but we never did have
we should have done one together. I regret that. There's so many. How did we were going to lose him? Only 72 years old, you know.
Yeah, you know, I didn't even know he was sick.
That's just what I was going to say. I didn't know he was sick, though. I had no idea.
He had been sick for a few months. I was constantly in touch with his staff. They reported and they believed and they had been told that he was making a good recovery. It was cancer, but that he was making a good recovery. And then when he died, you know, and we connected to commiserate together and grieve. I said, well, when did you know that this was not going to, that he was not going to survive it? When did it become clear to you that that this was not going to, the treatment wasn't going to work? And they said, not till the morning of the day he died.
Oh,
is that right?
He was going to recover until the morning of the day he died.
Really?
Yeah.
We should just refresh. Somebody's asked about some of the names that you mentioned, Robbie, and it's Shelby Steele, of course.
Yeah, Shelby Steele, he wrote a little book that very influential in its time called The Content of Our Character, still worth reading.
Yeah.
Of course, Thomas Sowell's a famous economist, trained at the University of Chicago, a Marxist in his early years, became a great conservative social commentator. Yeah. I believe I mentioned Leon Cass, who's one of our deepest thinkers. Cornel knows him, of course.
There's a problem, you know, with Cass, and that is he keeps writing these books on the books of the Bible, in the Jewish Bible. He's written Genesis
and now Exodus.
And they're each about 1,000 pages. And as I say to my study partner,
he has a wonderful, I really commend it. An early book. Those later books are great too. I mean, the commentary on Genesis and now the commentary on Exodus, which is just out, those are fantastic.
Yeah.
But people should go back to an early work of his called, it's a really collection of essays called Toward a More Natural Science. very valuable reflection on the role of science and the interaction of science and society. Dr. Cass is trained as a scientist, actually, biochemistry PhD and an MD,
Right.
medical doctor. But of course, he spent most of his life as a humanities teacher, really as a philosophy teacher. And he's got a unique and very valuable perspective. I also mentioned the young scholar, Yuval Levin. When I think of young conservative scholars that I'd like my progressive friends to engage and read, I think of Yuval Levin, I think of Ryan Anderson, my former student Melissa Moskela. There's some great young scholars on the conservative side that need to be read more than simply by conservatives. People across the spectrum need to be acquainted with these thinkers.
You mentioned Yuval Levin. Cornel, do you have an analogous person on the left that we should be reading?
Yeah, who are the young scholars on the left?
Who would be the young scholars? So that's a good question.
Danielle Allen would be one. I mean,
Danielle Allen is talking with strangers. You know, she's thinking about running for governor of Massachusetts. Yeah, but she's brilliant. But our own dear brother Eddie Glaude was
Eddie Glaude at Princeton, right?
Democracy in Black. Sister Keonga Taylor.
I have not read her work. Now, she's a colleague of mine here at...
she's there at Princeton, absolutely. And in many ways, she's more radical than my dear brother Eddie, even though Eddie's highly, highly, highly brilliant and progressive. But who would be some of the others? Oh, Imani Perry. Whoa, powerful. She's also at Princeton.
It's all through the Princeton faculty here. Don't you have any at Harvard?
But the important thing is, but it's like the jazz musicians, you know, you don't just listen to your friends, you know, you got to listen to all the different voices that are highly cultivated, that have shown themselves to be in a zone of excellence that can help you in your quest for excellence. And so it is intellectually. That's what we were talking about, Burke and Plato and Aquinas and the others, no matter how conservative they are, or how progressive they are, how leftists or revolutionary, they got something to say.
You know, I learned something interesting the other day. A great bluegrass musician, he wasn't a banjo player, probably the greatest of the bluegrass guitarists, a guy named Tony Rice died. Also at a young age, he was, I think, around 70. Anyway, Tony Rice died, and I did not know this until reading his obituary, that he spent an enormous amount of time listening to Coltrane. So you got a bluegrass guitar player listening to John Coltrane's very innovative.
I didn't realize. And this is brother Tony Rice.
And
R-I-C-E.
Profoundly influenced his guitar playing. I mean, it's amazing how great artists in one field are drawing on what they, the great artists in other fields or other genres.
I mean, another good example would be, you look at Al Green.
Yeah.
From Arkansas, the genius from Arkansas. His album, Let's Stay Together.
Yep.
And the fourth song is written by Hank Williams.
I did not know that. How about that?
So Let's Stay Together. Everybody know about, are you doing okay when he's singing falsetto beyond falsetto? You know, he making Eddie Kendrick sit down because his falsetto is beyond falsetto. That's Al Green. But then he moves right into Hank Williams.
That's amazing.
Let me jump in here, gentlemen, really quick, just to say this Zoom meeting may automatically close at 7 exactly, because I had it set for 3 hours.
Okay.
That's cool.
I've got a question.
That's cool.
I've got a question, I think, for Cornel, but Robbie, if you know something on this, be sure to come in. So I've got a friend who's wonderful that you guys should know about. His name is Aryeh Tepper. So he's an Israeli who's into Israeli jazz in particular.
Wow.
And he sort of looks at Coltrane in the same way as Maimonides. He says, man, somehow they were connected to some huge electric transmission line. It's a direct connection to God. Okay, that's the first thing. And then the second is he's been looking at Albert Murray's work a whole lot. Cornel, have you looked at Albert Murray's work much? What's your take?
Oh my God, I knew Albert Murray. I used to travel the country with him. I'm the Americans. Of course, his novels were very important, but most importantly, I'm the Americans, probably the best thing that he did. But his stuff on the blues, he's written the best book ever written on the blues called Stomping the Blues.
Exactly.
And then this University of Kansas lecture, The Hero in the Blues. But no, Murray and I, we used to go at it tooth and nail. We loved it. I learned so much from him. He was much older.
Yeah.
But Murray, of course, is the intellectual foundation of Brother Winton's operation at Clinton, at the Lincoln Center, with the late great Stanley Kraut.
Right.
Yeah. Now he's another one who died too young.
Yeah, he's one of the great jazz writers. He and I used to fight it out because he's a deep conservative brother too, politically. When it comes to jazz criticism,
Murray.
They don't get better than Stanley. But Stanley was a student of Albert Murray, and then
who's
Marcellus was a student of Stanley.
Someone whose jazz criticism I always enjoyed and learned so much from was Nat Hentoff. Did you read Nat Hentoff?
Oh my gosh, yes. Now, he was my partner too. We spent a lot of good time together.
Yeah, right. You knew Nat?
Oh my God, I saw him just right before he died when he was in a wheelchair. That was a giant, man.
Yeah.
My God, but his stuff on Malcolm X, you know, his stuff on Malcolm, he was a very close friend of Malcolm X, man. Malcolm trusted him.
Wow. Wow.
Oh yeah, he trusted Nat Hentoff, man. And Hentoff was a pioneer. He and Barry Ulanoff, it's a whole wave of those folk in the middle part of the 20th century, disproportionately Jewish brothers, a whole wave of them who understood, you know, what was at stake in the arts, in the music, and so forth. But Hentoff was a giant, but he had courage to come out against abortion that really marginalized him on the left, man.
He was an independent thinker. He's a man.
He was an independent. I used to tell him all the time. I disagreed with him, but it took a lot of courage to cut against the grain like that, because he really believed, you know, he followed the arguments and the evidence and so forth. Same is true in terms of his libertarianism, defense of civil law.
Cornel, one of my buddies was a guy named Paul Pines, who ran a club in New York for many years called the Tin Palace. Great writer, and lots of the, you know, Mingus hung out there and among the heavies. At the end of his life, he was a little bit bitter because, he was a Jewish guy, a white guy who ran a jazz club for 10 years in the 70s. And he felt that Stanley was trying to cut out the white participation in jazz in the 70s and in the 80s. What's your take on that? Any comment?
There was a big debate. Remember the New Republic, and then Stanley got booted out of Downbeat on that. No, I think Stanley, he was such a perfectionist that he saw mediocrity in all of its forms. And he thought there was a mediocrity setting in jazz criticism that cut across color. He said it would cut across color. So that you think, for example, I mean, his relation to Peter Gorolnik or some of these folk who've been at it for a long time, know what they're talking about, on the cutting edge. He loved them, you know, he loved them like fellow critics who he respected.
Yeah.
But there are others that he didn't.
Yeah.
And so when he thought the mediocrity was at work, because I mean, you know, this was the case among Black intellectuals. Oh my God, Stanley would come out swinging. Because he felt that they were not being true to the genius of the music, and the music set such high standards, and he's right about that. Yeah. The music sets such high standards. To be a critic of the music, I mean, it's like trying to be a critic of Beethoven. I mean, you know, Hanslick and the others, they're gonna fall in their faces. They don't know what they're talking about,
right?
Because the music's too rich, it's too deep. You really got to be prepared.
Did he feel the music was losing energy as well towards the end of his life, or not? Oh yeah. No, Stanley actually, following Went, you know, he believed that once free jazz set in under Coltrane, under Eric Dolphy. Oh really?
He thought that was already the end. That's why Lincoln Center is such a neo-traditionalist institution when it comes to jazz history.
Yeah, trying to keep the past alive.
So to keep the past alive, but you figure, well, after 65, come on, you got some towering figures out there doing some things, but sometimes the sounds can be a little strange. But I mean, it's like yourself. You've written 6 symphonies in the 21st century.
Yeah.
That's a difficult thing to pull off.
Yeah.
It's got to be an unbelievable challenge given the weight of Beethoven, Mahler, and Bruckner. And so, you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, but
Daniel, how are you gonna deal with that anxiety influence?
You know what I tell people? I had a teacher once who said, "How can you write a string quartet after Bartok?" And I said, "Oh, well, then how can you write symphonies after Beethoven? How can you write songs after Schubert?" You know, the answer is you just sit your butt in the seat. Oops, and you're right. That's what you got to do.
That's
what you
exactly
gotta
right.
do.
That's
And what do
exactly
you-
right.
What do you do after Coltrane and Miles? And the answer is you just try and do the very best you can and see
You
if
can. But that's exactly what you had to do before they came on the scene.
Exactly. Exactly. What do you think
mean,
of
After Opus 131, the Beethoven's next to last string quartet, do you think anybody in their right mind wants to write another string quartet after that? No, you go for it. Go for it. That's not
Exactly.
even his major genre. You know what I mean?
I do. I know exactly.
Absolutely.
I know exactly what you mean.
Very much. But I know we got to run. No, you all stay strong.
Yeah.
Stay strong.
Guys, thanks for being here.
I can grab you for 1 second before